Hello, Mr. Rahul.
Hi, Siddharth. Thank you for having me on the show. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much as well. And I hope everything's well with you.
All well so far. Been indoors for the better part of the last 4 months. Let's hope for the best that we tide through this pandemic and the situation improves globally.
Right, right. And how's Goa doing?
Go's been not too bad, to be honest, when you hear of the spike in cases, particularly in the bigger states like
Right.
Maharashtra, West Bengal, Karnataka. I think from that point of view, we're much better off. Although having said that, over the last few weeks, there has been a spike in cases in Goa as well.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I had heard news, I guess, a month or two back that, the cases were really low. And then, anyway, hopefully things get better. And what about sports in Goa? Things, I mean, I know they're not back to normal, but have stuff started? Has football started? Has any sport started?
Well, unfortunately, not with. You do find a few recreational users playing sport, and particularly football, given that football is the official sport and it is part of our
Yeah.
culture here in Goa. So in the smaller turfs and particularly on the beach, you do have kids who've now started to come out and play over the last couple of weeks.
Hmm.
But it is nowhere close to returning back to normal. I think that will take a few more months, Siddharth.
Right, right. So, yeah, why don't you talk to us about football, the culture in Goa? Like, what's unique about it?
Well, so to begin with, Goa is the only state with an official sport, and
Hmm.
there's no prizes for guessing that, football it is,
Right.
which is the official sport of the state of Goa, which was declared by the former chief minister, the late Manohar Parrikar, in 2012,
Hmm.
uh, soon after coming to power. We've had Goa as a state has had a love affair with the sport, uh, over the decades,
Yeah.
and I can kind of so relate because mine is a story like so many others here in
Mhm.
Goa.
Right.
We're never too far off from a football ground here.
Sure.
And so much like fish to water, it is something that kids invariably take up to, much like music as well, which is also part of the culture here. With me, I happen to grow up very close to, in the vicinity of the stadium here at Goa, the
Hmm.
Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium, quite literally down the road from where I grew up, about a 5 minute walk. And that's where my love affair with football started.
Right.
So it may have been, I was, when the stadium was inaugurated and it was built in record time of 6 months,
Wow.
I was as young as seven back then in 89.
Okay.
And I remember being taken to the opening of the stadium by my dad, who coincidentally happened to captain Pune University back in the day when he studied at Vadia College.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and immediately after that, we had a couple of big teams visit India. We had the Nehru Cup, the Nehru Gold Cup back then in the early 90s. You had football powerhouses uh, of that era, Hungary, Russia compete.
Hmm.
And so, it just, the bond with the sport just grew from there. And the rest, as they say, is history. But
Right.
those were my formative years.
Right.
And yeah,
Interesting. So, you played a lot of football growing up as well.
I did coincidentally. So since the age of five, pretty much everyone in my circle, like I said, back then we did have the gadgets that the kids have access to today. So for
Sure.
us, we looked for the evenings to to run to the nearest football ground to
Hmm.
kick about for a while.
Right. So when you say football ground, do you mean the beach or?
No. So, of course, more lately now, over the last few years, we've been doing that as in playing on the beach on weekends.
Hmm.
But there was a ground very close to where I lived, so
Right.
that's where normally everyone would assemble in the evenings for a game of football every evening without fail.
Hmm. Right. Right. So yeah, you grew up playing football, and then where do you go from there?
So like I said, the love affair with the sport grew from there,
Hmm.
and right through school, college, football was an essential part of my day to day activities.
Sure.
And then there came a tough point when I was in the ninth standard, where it was a hard choice between academics and football, of course. And football back then was
Oh,
still not seen as a viable career option.
definitely.
So I
Yeah.
did play the minis and Subroto for the school, but post that, of course, at the advice of my parents, I did take a break from the sport for a couple of years,
Right.
right through the completion of my 12th. And
Hmm.
then I got back to playing the sport, when in college. But I realized by then, those are the key years between the ages of 13 and 18.
Yeah.
And I realized very quickly back then. So even though I did captain Mangalore University later, in 2006,
Hmm.
I realized that I'd basically missed the boat in terms of the aspirations and dreams of becoming a professional footballer. And
Sure.
so it's at that point that one, reality struck, but two, that I realized that I wanted to do something with sport, and the next best option would be to work in sport.
Right.
And so that led to me eventually pursuing my MBA in football industries at the University of Liverpool, and having been involved in sport over the last 12, 13 years.
Interesting. Interesting. So how was your experience there?
Liverpool, I thought it was fantastic. There were some great speakers, who delivered lectures on the course. The networking opportunities were phenomenal,
Hmm.
right from all the top clubs in Europe. So we had these study tours to whether it was Anfield, Old Trafford, Stamford Bridge, to
Sure.
the UEFA headquarters. We were fortunate to meet a lot of these very, very senior executives at these clubs.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Peter Kenyon back then was chief executive, and there were several others, who we interacted with, not just on one occasion, but several occasions within the university campus and at the stadiums on our visits. So I think overall it was a fantastic experience as a football fan. Just being able to attend some of those really, really high profile games
Right.
that until then you only heard of and saw on television, to be able to go and actually watch a Liverpool we United game live.
Sure.
Initially it was surreal, to be honest, the whole experience. So
Right.
yeah, some of the best experiences in my life to date.
Hmm. Great. Great. So why did you, I mean, you decided to take your studies and bring it back to India instead of probably, staying back and working with um, European clubs?
So I did have a very good break, Siddharth, and I was really fortunate soon after the course to have landed a job with Mr. Brian Barwick, who was the ex-chief exec of the English Football Association.
Hmm.
And soon after his FA days, or his days at the FA, he founded this company called Barwick Media and Sport. So I spent a couple of years working with Mr. Barwick. And then I
Right.
realized that the opportunities were only going to increase in India,
Mm-hmm.
and that football was certainly on the rise. I was again very fortunate, extremely fortunate, and this I'm talking of 2012, early 2013, to
Right.
have met with some very senior executives of IMG based in London at the
Mm.
London office, who
Right.
said to me that something of this nature was on the cards, and that's when they were talking about setting up a new league in India,
Mm-hmm.
and I realized that the opportunities were only going to increase from there on. So
Right.
it was a very difficult decision to make,
Mm-hmm.
because I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the UK, and I particularly enjoyed my time with Barwick Media and Sport. The office was located in a very pristine part of London
Sure.
called Twickenham,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is located in the southwest, very close, in fact, walking distance to the Twickenham Stadium, and the rugby stadium that holds about has a capacity of about 90 odd thousand people.
Right.
So a very pristine part of the UK, and just generally fell in love with the culture there. I thought it was great. So difficult decision, but then upon my return, I was already evaluating options and reaching out to agencies and clubs, in India, and then I
Mm-hmm.
was fortunate to get a break with Procam International, who are the pioneers of the distance running movement in the country, but
Mm-hmm.
had some very exciting properties in football as well.
Right. Right. That's great. Um, just a follow-up question to that. What difference did you find in the football culture in, let's say, UK, London, and Kerala? Considering Kerala, I mean, like you mentioned, the main sport is football. So, what is the difference?
I think in terms of purely the passion, we have it here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Kerala is a great example. Kerala, Calcutta and Bengal, Goa, the Northeast have been hotbeds of football over the years.
Sure.
Kerala, when you look at any of the ISL games that Kerala Blasters are playing at home, you realize, with 65,000 passionate fans, it's a
Right.
sea of yellow. It's quite the experience watching a game there.
Sure.
So in terms of passion, I don't think there's too much different.
Mm-hmm.
I think what England have going for them, and much like the other European countries who are doing very well in football or who have done well, Germany, Spain, you name it. These countries have a history. You look at England, and they have 100-year-old history in football.
Right.
In India, with the league, the National Football League, having begun only in '97,
Right.
we have a long way. Of course, we've come a long way since the inaugural edition of the National Football League, but
Sure.
we have a long way to go. I think it would be fair to equate football in UK to cricket in India,
Right.
because with cricket we go back, the decades. We have that the number of years, the decades that we've achieved, and we've achieved success at the highest level,
Sure.
which unfortunately has not happened with football, and will take a few more years. But the day that happens, that's when you'll see the complete change, in the dynamic of particularly football. Of course, there are other sports where things are already, you know, uh, changing significantly. I'd like to kind of talk about badminton, and I know, someone like Pulela Gopichand is doing a fantastic work with the youngsters,
Sure.
not only the youngsters but also the elite athletes.
Sure.
And why have we seen that sea change in a sport like badminton? It is only because we've able to we now have athletes who are competing at the world stage.
Sure.
You have the likes of the PV Sindhus who are doing phenomenally well for themselves on the world stage. And I think it is important to create world champions. And that just generally, even with youngsters, it excites them a lot more. With
Right.
parents, you've probably seen that, over the last 10, 12 years, where at one point, even me growing up, there was no other option other than academics. Sport
Hmm.
was just not seen as a full-time viable career option, unless, of course, you were an aspiring cricketer. But you had the millions of kids looking to make it big in cricket. So there
Right.
as well, the challenge was the numbers with a country and a population like ours. But
Right.
today, you see a lot more parents encouraging their kids to take up sport with,
Hmm.
with particularly the salaries that the ISL clubs are offering, for example,
Right.
or that some of these professional athletes, whether it's even kabaddi athletes for that matter, but tennis players, badminton players, you realize that parents realize now that academics is not the be it and end all.
Sure.
There is definitely, if my son or daughter makes it in sport, he could really make it big in life.
Sure. Sure. So I'll touch upon that in a bit. Um,
Certainly.
what has been the growth of football like since
In
the league that you mentioned that was started in '97?
Yeah. So I think in the initial years in '97, and I remember going to almost each of those games, each and every of those games, they
Mm-hmm.
didn't go up in the initial years of the league, which was the National Football League when it was conceptualized, which later then became the sorry, which later became the I League.
Mm-hmm.
But there were crowds at the stadium. That's something I think the ISL has managed to do very well.
Right.
It's not initial in the first few years of the ISL. Of course, you needed the Razmatas. Of course, you needed the big names to attract the eyeballs, to get the fans back in the stadium. But
Sure.
I think having done that successfully, now they've gone back to, most clubs are signing younger players. The quality of foreigners has improved significantly, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion, from year one. So that all will eventually help improve the quality of the sport. Most importantly, however, I think with the reduction of foreign players year on year, it's a fine balance, between the quality of games that you have and the number of foreigners that are permitted,
Right.
particularly on the pitch. And that eventually determines the quality of a game in developing football countries.
Right.
But having said that, there was a huge following. I remember, up till about 2005,
Mm-hmm.
when Sporting Club de Goa played Mahindra United in that famous Federation Cup final in Goa.
Mm-hmm.
It was a full house, and back then, I still have fond memories of the stadium, because right now they have seats all across the stadium. But back then, and I'm talking until probably about 2010, there were seats only on the west side of the stadium, the west stand, and the
Right.
north stand. So basically, the east and the south were concrete. Was the concrete seating arrangement. So
Sure.
people would really crowd in there. So now, if today, for example, the official seating capacity at the stadium in Goa is about 18,000. Back then, for the really big games, you'd have about 22, 25,000 people cramped in there.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So, just a question about the ISL from an outsider. Do the players who play in the ISL, sorry, do they aspire to play in the ISL and you know build and grow the league and get loyal to the club, or do they see it as a stepping stone and see it as an opportunity to maybe get picked up by the scouts and go to the EPL or the La Liga?
So I think that would be a long-term dream for a lot of the players.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the sooner an Indian can break into a top league, of course, there's been very positive news lately with, a couple of our youngsters, very talented boys, one having joined a third division club in Spain, one having joined a third division club in Portugal. That's very promising. And I think the sooner an Indian footballer makes it to one of the big leagues in Europe, that's the day you'll see the explosion with the sport or the fan following of a particular club in the country. But for now, I think, the ISL, like I mentioned, simply by virtue of the salaries on offer, are able to attract the best talent there is from the I League
Right.
into the ISL. Of course, a couple of weeks ago, you heard of, the merger of ATK and Monbagan, which is again another big step. Now, the repercussions or the impact of the merger will only be known 3-4 years down the line, and that will, of course, depend on how many other clubs are allowed to move up to the ISL, particularly from the point of view of, one of the biggest derbies in the world, as it's considered, is the derby played between Monbagan and East Bengal, which till today, witnesses attendances of close to 100,000.
Right.
But I think if you ask me, with all the measures that the AFF have taken, particularly with the introduction of the baby leagues, I attended a webinar recently where they've now simplified it even further. So they're looking to kind of expand the sport to ensure that it reaches every nook and corner of the country. And thereby they've completely simplified the process. So tomorrow, and without excessive funding, so with a bit of funding, anyone literally with a love for the sport could organize, a baby league. You don't need a full 11-a-side ground. You can organize them on the smaller pitches, the 5-a-side, the 7-a-side, the futsal pitches. So they've made the whole process very simple. And that's very important because, only when your base of the pyramid, and I keep repeating, it's when your base of the pyramid, the larger the base of your pyramid, the better are your chances of finding that one exceptional talent, for which you'll require millions and millions of kids to be playing the sport just for the love of the sport, and then eventually progressing into becoming professionals.
Right. So I guess this is one of the questions with the sleeping giant tag. Right. What is missing in Indian football?
I think we've like I keep saying, I think we've taken the AFF, the governing body, of course, has taken some very proactive measures. We have a union sports minister in Kiran Rijiju who's extremely proactive, and I think is taking the right measures, of course. But I think in the long run, sports, has to be looked at as an industry where I think, the government needs to step in with, whether it's with tax breaks, with SOPs, to further, propel investment in sport. Now, if you look at sport on the whole, I think there's several factors that determine, or that could help propel India as a country become a sporting nation. One, you need great infrastructure in place. And I think, the government of Odisha has taken several steps to ensure, the promotion of sports infrastructure in the state of Odisha. They've also done exceedingly well by offering incentives to, whether it's the AFF youth teams, ISL clubs. So Delhi moved base from Delhi to Odisha. So they've taken all the right steps over the last couple of years to attract not only investment in sport, but also attract to ensure that sport is further developed, right from the grassroots level.
Yeah.
What happens is sometimes now you have, like I mentioned, Pulela Gopichan earlier, you do have private promoters or individual promoters who
Mm-hmm.
are doing a lot for sport themselves.
Right.
But two questions arise: how many individuals do we have who, one, have that pedigree or the experience in sport, and two, are willing to invest in sport without looking at an immediate ROI?
Right.
Which kind of leads to the question that, is enough CSR money being utilized or kind of invested in sport? Is that
Mm-hmm.
something that we can tap into?
Right.
Again, with infrastructure, going back to infrastructure, in my opinion, sports infrastructure is divided basically into two aspects. One, you have infrastructure for the elite athletes,
Right.
and one is for the recreational users and for grassroots development of the sport.
Right.
Now, invariably, to produce world champions, you need state of the art facilities, which are essentially only going to be used by elite athletes, and that's how it should be.
Right.
But I think what we need a lot more of is facilities for kids to just be able to go up there and play, and good facilities. Goa probably is an example where I always say we have so many assets. Goa could have been a hub for sports tourism.
Sure.
Look at the grounds, and we talk about Goa's affinity, or Goan's affinity to football. Goa, a small state like Goa, has about 206 playing football fields. Seven asides and 9 asides, 11 asides, 7 asides, and bigger essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But the harsh reality is about 80% of those are either unplayable or are in bad shape.
Right.
So I think from that point of view, the PPP model also needs to kind of be implemented in a lot more states and cities.
Mm-hmm.
I know, they have a great model going on in Gujarat with the Trans Stadia project, but you need so many more of those. And I think I set up Square Sports Solutions last year with the basic aim of connecting these dots, Siddharth.
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at how we can improve the overall, not just the quality of sports infrastructure, but the availability and the accessibility of sports infrastructure to budding athletes and just kids in general to be able to take up sport.
Right.
How do you then channelize the talent that we have? You speak to a lot of the youth coaches, the foreign youth coaches who've either had stints in India or spent some time in India, and they will all tell you one thing: that kids in India, and I'm talking of football, and I'm sure same is the case with most other sporting disciplines. Kids in India are technically just as good as kids in the UK, for example,
Mm-hmm.
in the ages of 12 to 16.
Right.
And then somehow they just vanish, from the scene. So what happens to them? Is the focus on, okay, at some point, do they suddenly realize, okay, I don't think I'm going to make it. Let me focus on my academics. Is
Mm-hmm.
it the lack of, proper coaching methodologies, sports science, nutrition, all of that? Can we have all of that implemented at a much younger age,
Right.
to ensure that the talent is kind of channelized and not lost at a young age? I think even with coaching badges now, there are a lot more coaches in India have the A and B license badges, the AFC, and of course pro license as well, but pro A, B, C license badges.
Mm-hmm.
But I think again, the quality of coaching needs to improve the overall. So you have some terrific Indian coaches, but how do they pass on that knowledge, the experience, to ensure that we have thousands, hundreds and thousands of coaches at a basic level who are able to kind of impart their knowledge in turn to kids. So, of course, going back a few years, Rob Barn had developed, as technical director of the AFF, had developed this Laksha plan, which was the roadmap for India.
Right.
It's great to create a curriculum like that, but I think where we fail is implementation of these great plans.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's about connecting the dots, at every level. Like I said,
Sure.
sports infrastructure needs to be developed. How do we get to channelize, talent at a young age, groom budding athletes starting at a very young age, to ensure that by the time they're 15 and 16, you already know that this boy or girl in the next 5 years is going to be on the world stage. And many a times we tend to start late. So we say, okay, let the kid start at 13, 14 maybe. Of course, that
Mm-hmm.
as well is changing, because now you look at cities like Delhi and Bombay and Bangalore and even Goa with the academies that you have. Goa, the difference being you have so many clubs doing so much, so that's probably why I say that, the academies, the paid academies, don't generally end up working in a place like Goa, simply because, we have 100 odd clubs, each of them. So each village has a club. Plus, you have the professional clubs, the
Right.
big institutions, whether it's Salgankar, Dempo, Churchill, Sporting Club, who do so much. They have all the entire pipeline in place. When I say pipeline, they have all the age group teams in place. They have a senior team competing in the Goa Professional League. They do so much with grassroots. So, but with the other cities, Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, with the number of academies that have sprung up. In fact, recently, I think it was Gopi Chand who mentioned that in Hyderabad alone, between sporting disciplines, there's something close to about 900 academies. And I was really
Wow.
surprised by that number. So, yeah, so you increasingly have younger and younger kids taking up to sport. But, can we show them the professional path?
Yeah.
What does tend to happen is, I think it's proven the world over that 90% of your world beaters will come from, very, very poor and impoverished backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So here, do we have a system in place to kind of, nurture these kids who don't have the financial resources, to manage maybe academics and sport simultaneously? Because with these kids, it's a very delicate situation. It's what happens many a times in France, and you would never want to get to a situation like that. So in France, basically, a lot of these rich African agents get these young boys via sea to the French border, because that's probably the France and Luxembourg, even Belgium, because those are the easiest ports of entry. And, on the pretext and on the premise of getting them trials at one of these big clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes parents even sell their houses and pretty much everything they have to fund that one trip. But if the boy doesn't make it, if the boy doesn't make it, then what happens? Like I mentioned, cases like France, like Luxembourg and Belgium are classic examples,
Right.
where the African agents take these boys really young, some of them as young as 13, 14, on the present pretext of getting them trials at some of these big clubs. And those are the easiest ports of entry by sea. But if they don't make it, what happens? So that's why you have so many of these kids, 17, 18-year-olds, just on the streets, homeless kids, which is a shame, and which is something you definitely not want to happen, in India.
Sure.
So do we have, for example, a meritorious scholarship program that could be implemented in every state and implemented effectively. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of these schemes, but how many of these are really being implemented effectively? Where is the accountability sometimes, for the funds that are allocated to, deserving and meritorious sportsmen and sportswomen?
Sure.
Do the resources always land up, reaching the sportsman or sportswoman? I don't think so. So I think
Right.
overall, we need to get more professional on several fronts. The challenge is, of course, we are a big country, diverse cultures, languages, but I think that's also what adds to the beauty of our country. And I think what gives us real hope. If you look at the teams when they assemble, I know for a fact that, of course, now a lot of talent is coming through from the Northeast, particularly when you're talking of football. But look at the under 17 team that played the World Cup, the Indian under 17 team, or the current under 16 women's team that's training. They were based in Goa prior to the pandemic.
Right.
But it's so wonderful to see, that the team is composed of girls and boys in the case of the under 17 boys team from all across the country.
Sure.
And I think that makes it great. But I think we really have our challenges, and we really have to step up our game to ensure that someday India becomes a sporting power.
Most definitely. And yeah, when you mentioned sports infrastructure, I had another guest, in this podcast, and he was mentioning that he had, studied in the US, taken a tennis scholarship, and he
Yeah.
was saying like and he didn't get into a really good college, right? So he got into one of those second division colleges, and he was saying that the facilities that were available to him wouldn't even be available to the most elite athletes in India. So such a huge, I mean, they had, let's say,
Disparity.
15 tennis courts. They had,
Yeah.
a whole team of psychologists. They had
Yep.
nutrition and 2, 3 gyms and a stadium available just for the tennis players. And, you
Yep.
know, when you compare it, to here,
Mm-hmm.
like you mentioned, the best facilities should be available to the elite athletes. But then, even the players or athletes who are coming up the ranks, they should be given,
Yep.
I won't say equal, but at least something similar.
Yep.
Similar opportunities, similar facilities to be able to, build
Yep.
their game up to that level.
Yes. I agree completely, Siddharth. And when I mentioned elite athletes, I'd like to clarify that I'm not talking of those who've only made it, not just the world champions, not just
Right.
the PV Sindhus of the world, but I'm talking of elite athletes at every age group. So let's say you have, an Indian under 13 champion in badminton, for example. All of across age groups, I think should have access to very, very elite sporting facilities. That is one. And then, of course, you have facilities that should be made available to the others, which, of course, cannot be compromised in quality. You still need to maintain the quality, but obviously with the current state of affairs and as we are, given how we stand as a sporting nation currently, I would say this would be a stepping stone. And this gentleman you spoke about nailed it on the head. The reason why China, the America, the USA, countries like these are able to produce so many Olympic champions is because, one, they start really young, and it's a fully professional system with access to the best facilities. Like you mentioned, you have sports science professionals, nutritionists, psychologists, physiotherapists, the works, and I'm glad to see that increasingly more and more youngsters are now taking up to professional sports management courses.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's quite a few institutes that have been operating in India over the last couple of years,
Right.
and a few others are due to open soon. But I think that is the way forward, where you have professionals for every particular discipline,
Right.
and yeah, that helps immensely, immensely. I take the case of individual sports particularly. Again, I know things are changing. I know a lot of people are making a conscious effort to further, aid the development of the sport. But there was a point in time when a lot of individual athletes look at, even I'd say probably to an extent it was evident more than most with the Indian men's hockey team.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Right.
not that we were technically inferior to some of the leading countries
Right.
in world hockey, be it Holland or Germany or Australia. It's just that we faltered at the very end,
Right.
the final hurdle, the last couple of minutes. And that comes from mental toughness. So
Sure.
sport is just about mental toughness as it is about your technical ability. And that's where you have sports psychologists who come in, to work with teams. So
Sure.
yeah, so a point very well made by the gentleman,
Right. So, what is the role of the private sector? I mean, you mentioned the PPP, but what is the role of the private sector, and how should they work along with the government in building this infrastructure?
Mhm. So I keep going back because I think the trans state is a great model currently
Mm-hmm.
in that can be followed. Of course, there's several others that are now surfacing or have been around for a couple of years. The Dravid Padukone Academy in Bangalore, state of the art,
Right.
and doing very well from what I hear. The Lodha Group has come up with something similar on the outskirts of Bombay with the Palava city. So they have these extensive sports infrastructure to cover about 8-10 sporting disciplines.
Sure.
But I think, we need, like I said, the government, as much as the government can do, would be the government does have access to huge land parcels. And I
Right.
think in the very least, if the government can come forward, and tie up with, whether it's big corporates or individual promoters who are ready to invest huge sums of money on the development of sport, then it is a complete win-win for all,
Sure.
you know. And of course, there are, from what I hear, there's a few others in the pipeline. I know the government of Odisha, for example, has commissioned about 8 of these state-of-the-art facilities.
Mm-hmm.
Work is likely to commence soon. There was a recent article pertaining to Mizoram going to install 16 artificial turfs, and all of it being funded by the central government. So these are great initiatives that will further help, develop sport in the country.
Definitely. Definitely. And what is your opinion on multi-purpose centers? Would you prefer, to have these multi-purpose centers, or, focus centers where they just focus on one sport?
Now, I think the way forward, if you're looking now, if they're elite sporting centers, and those
Mm-hmm.
are few and far between, and that's how it should be, if you ask me,
Right.
because they're expensive to set up, they're expensive to maintain.
Sure.
So, those are for possibly the elite athletes from every state, and you should have one of those for probably each sporting discipline.
Right.
But regards the rest of the sports infrastructure, I think it's so important that they are multi-purpose, because that's the only way they can be, made economically viable and sustainable.
Right.
So during the times of the year when, sport is probably not played all that much, come the end of a season, for example, you're talking of the months of June and July, and Dubai is a great example where, the extensive facilities are used for things like trade fairs and, for several other purposes, including things like rock concerts and things like that. So even stadia, look at Wembley Stadium, for example,
Mm-hmm.
which is, England's showcase to the world. But
Right.
even at Wembley, they have, at one point of the year, towards the end of, or post the football season, they have a couple of big rugby games there. Then you have, rock concerts
Right.
again at Wembley, and all of that helps generate revenue to ensure that the asset that you've created is sustainable in the long
Yeah.
run. Otherwise you really wouldn't see it encouraging private promoters or corporates to come forward to invest in these facilities if it didn't make commercial sense in the long run.
Sure. Right. Right. So, all right. And we were talking about cricket
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
So, where does cricket come into the picture in this wave? And can other sports match up to it?
Good point. So cricket, every sport, again, there's two aspects. One is the kids, the number of kids that you have, or individuals that you have playing the sport,
Right.
and the other is the viewership aspect of the sport.
Sure.
If you ask me, if it's purely on the viewership front,
Mm-hmm.
I think any and every other sport will always come a distant second to cricket, at least in India.
Okay.
And I think, of course, the defining point was that 1983 World Cup win,
Mm-hmm.
that set cricket on a trajectory, and no other sport has been able to come close. Having said that, today, a lot of the youngsters, particularly in the metros, follow the foreign leagues very closely.
Definitely.
So, you pick up a kid who's playing football in a city like Bombay and Delhi, a 12 to 14-year-old, and he'll probably be able to tell you stats such as the league's top scorers for the past 5 seasons,
Right.
and who's been the most outstanding midfielder, goalkeeper. So he's got all those stats with him. But how many of these kids are actually following in domestic sport, whether
Right.
it's football or any other? And that is where the challenge lies. So yes, of course, with the millennials, the viewership in football has increased significantly,
Mm-hmm.
and in terms of playing the sport as well. But I think purely from a viewership of professional sport in the country, in India, pertaining to Indian clubs or national teams, I think cricket will always have the edge. Again, that's an interesting point, because if you look at the Ranji Trophy, for example, which is the
Mm-hmm.
domestic tournament for cricket, I wouldn't be so sure that there'd be too many followers of the Ranji game.
Right.
But that kind of that when you talk of the T20s or the IPL, which is postponed this year, or
Mm-hmm.
when the Indian national team is playing, an international, you realize that the numbers just kind of beat every other sport here, hands down. And that is the only reason why sponsors are so averse to putting the little money that they have in other sports.
Sure.
Of course, what's worked well, if I were to pick an example from the recent years, I'd say kabaddi. Kabaddi
Mm-hmm.
was a sport that was played in the fields, and they've managed to professionalize that, give it the glitz and glamour, and now being played in stadiums. And you suddenly have sponsors queuing up, to kind of be involved with the Pro Kabaddi League. I hear that the sponsorship figures have kind of gone through the roof over the last couple of seasons. So
Mm-hmm.
these are very encouraging signs, And I think overall, generally, like I said, viewership with certain sports have certainly increased, even on ground, just kids taking up to the sport. I know when PV Sindhu won her last, I forget, one of these major titles.
Right.
I remember everyone, you had even grandmothers out, wanting to play a bit of badminton. So it's great, when you create world beaters, it just kind of gets everyone hooked on to a sport, or a lot more people hooked onto a sport.
Sure, sure. And yeah, when you mentioned the EPL, players, like I remember I was 6 years old, and I remember I was six, around seven, when Rio Ferdinand got transferred to United, and I remember the
Yep.
transfer fees and everything. And that was back
Yep.
in early 2000s,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it just, do you think there should be, I know it sounds really outrageous, but there should be a censorship, I won't say censorship, but um of course there should be more marketing done by the ISL and other football leagues that go on, but do you think controlling the viewership of the EPL and showing more of the Indian sports will help in any way? Or because I don't, I mean, when I mean, as an outsider, I mean, who's always followed football as a United fan, when I
Mm-hmm.
watch United play, it just, and then I watch an ISL match, there's just a stark, I mean, there's a huge difference, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
it's just an honest opinion, right? I mean, of course I do want Indian football to grow, but what can be
Yep.
done to build that interest amongst
Yep.
I mean, to increase that viewership?
Yep. So I think from that perspective, at the end of the day, as a true sports fan, uh, a sports fan is always going to be inclined towards, quality sport.
Sure.
Now, even somebody says to me, he says, I follow tennis avidly.
Right.
Uh, but what does that avidly mean? So if you turn around and ask him, how many recent tournaments where all of the three, let's say Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer did not participate, have you watched?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure my guess is that most of them would be nil. you
Definitely.
know so that's the point. I think, we had early access, and I can relate to your story because we had access to star early on, in our lives as growing up boys
Right.
in the age, I must have been about 12, 14. And the only thing we ever saw marketed so extensively was the Manchester United brand.
Sure.
And that's how I think we have so many kids today who are Manchester United fans. And of course, post that, they had the dramatic Champions League win, and all of that just added to their aura.
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, as a sports fan, you will always be inclined towards quality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's no substitute for improving the overall quality. You can try playing around with prime time slots, and I think the ISL has done that as well, with kickoffs at 7:30, even 8 o'clock. But I think, at the end of the day, given a choice between the two, unless you were personally invested,
Right.
because football, as you know, is about club loyalties. And
Sure.
so a lot of youngsters about our age, who are in their mid 20s and probably their 30s, can relate to a Manchester United or a Liverpool or an Arsenal or a Chelsea a
Sure.
lot more than they can relate to an ISL club, because this has been the last 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've been personally invested in that club, even though, a lot of them will unfortunately never possibly visit one of these stadiums for real. But
Right.
yet they're so completely invested, which is incredible. And I think that's the part of sport,
Mm-hmm.
if you ask me. So for us, I think the quality of, if you're talking of football, will have to improve. I know Reliance and particularly FSDL is doing a fantastic job with the academy setup that they have in Navi Mumbai.
Right.
I've been to the facility a few times. Everything's in close proximity. The kids are in a great environment. They have the school close by. They have tutors through the evening. The ground is not too far away. The facilities at the ground are good. Training a couple of times a day. So it needs more of those, to spring up, which will in the long run, because this is a process. It's not going to happen in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years, possibly not even in the next 10, but I think we have to set our sights on long-term goals. I read somewhere that the Japanese Football Association, have gone to the point of drawing up 100-year plan.
Wow.
100-year plan where eventually in the 100th year they'd end up winning the FIFA World Cup.
I wouldn't be surprised if they
do. So that's the level of planning that needs to go into it, and the implementation as well. So I think just kind of is because today with everything available on the digital space, it would be hard to restrict content from being viewed. Whether so if you don't have access to the television today, you have Hotstar, and there's so many other OTT platforms that you can access, and it's become a lot more convenient as well. So I don't think So I think eventually it's only when the overall quality of sport improves that
Yeah, when you mentioned content, I remember, I guess around 2 years back, they decided to charge us to watch. Charge us for Star Sports and ESPN, and I remember a lot of us, we didn't even bother paying that 100 or 200 rupees. We decided to stream it online through one of these, using VPN and stream it online. So yeah, people are going to find a way eventually.
And if I can quickly add, and what is very positive, Siddharth, and I'm really glad to see that, because I know during my time at FC Goa, we worked very hard to kind of engage fans. And what I'm really happy to see is the fact that the fan clubs now are surfacing. Most of the ISL clubs at least have a recognized fan club who are completely invested, in the fortunes of their club.
Right.
Bangalore is a great example.
Oh, yes.
But what I'm really excited about is the fact that so many fans have now started to travel. So the whole traveling to away games concept is really catching up.
Right.
So go back 2 years, 2018, when FC Goa played Bangalore in the ISL final at Mumbai. There must have been, unfortunately, not everyone could. We couldn't give tickets to all our fans because it was a sellout. But there must have been at least about 4,000 fans who traveled from Goa to Bombay for that final. And it's not just a final. I know fans who year on year since the ISL started, and ever since the inclusion of Jamshedpur, for example, in the ISL. And Jamshedpur, by the way, is a difficult city to get to. So you have no direct flights.
Right.
You either have a flight, and especially if you're traveling from Goa, it means a flight from Goa to Bombay, Calcutta, and then you probably have to get a train. Or the other option is to kind of get a flight to Bombay and then the train from Bombay to Jamshedpur. But it takes anywhere between 30 to 40 hours to make that trip. And we've had FC Goa. When I say FC Goa is fortunate to have fans who make that trip every single year, and that is nothing but passion.
Definitely. So that's incredible. And I will just talk to you about FC Goa in a bit. Just wanted to follow up with this question. In terms of culture, right? Like you mentioned, the passionate fans, and another guest I was talking to, and when you mentioned quality as well, in America, the people of that specific town support their colleges wholeheartedly,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
we still need to work on the cultural element of it, right? I mean, yes, there, of course, in when you talk about the NBA, yeah,
Yeah.
NBA has the best teams, but then
Yeah.
you still have thousands of people turning up for the college teams basketball matches,
I agree.
right?
I
So we
agree.
still need to work on that
Yep. Yep.
cultural part of sports.
Absolutely, I agree wholeheartedly. And UK is another great example where the club you actually support is the club closest to where you live. So the
Sure.
club could be in League One, League Two, League Three, and a lot of them will probably not have a second favorite. And
Right.
if they do, it'll be a distant second favorite, which is one of the bigger clubs.
Yeah.
But essentially, their loyalties lie with the local club.
Right. Right. So, okay, talk to us about your work with FC Goa. You were at a really high post. So, what was your work like?
Uh, 3 fantastic years I spent at the club.
Mm-hmm.
We're blessed, like I mentioned, Goa in a way is blessed to have such passionate fans. But they
Right.
were but they were 3 years that flew by very very quickly. But 3 years that I will treasure and I remember very fondly. So it happened about the time in 2016, and coincidentally, I had a few months prior taken on a role as chief exec at one of the other football clubs in Goa. And then FC Goa came calling in late August, and that's about the time when the ownership had just changed hands.
Sure.
So yeah, that first year was in fact very challenging because we were able to kind of, I know when the deal finally went through, there was barely about a month and a half to go to the start of the season,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and in all of that we had to get the boys out for preseason, and so they traveled to Brazil that year for about 20
Wow.
odd days, and getting the grounds in Goa ready, at least one training facility, because I remember Zico was the coach then,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a look at a few grounds. He wasn't entirely happy. So either the playing surface was okay, but in terms of just kind of the protection for the players, because with youngsters they're all keen to kind of meet their stars and heroes. So the fencing and stuff, the rest of the infrastructure was a miss. Or if that was in place, the playing surface was in really poor condition.
Right.
So we had a lot of challenges. We kind of looked at a lot of facilities, and then interestingly, we eventually went with Cesar, who've had their academy. In fact, a couple of academies in Goa for several decades now. But and have promoted extensively promoted football, through the Vedanta group.
Mm-hmm.
They had a facility in Sirsayi that had not been used for a couple of years, as the other residential facility was kind of being used. So this one was shut for a couple of years.
Sure.
So we moved in there for that season, and so we did everything from scratch and got the ground ready. In fact, when the boys came back from Brazil, the pitch was still not really up to the mark. So they trained elsewhere for a week, and then I eventually moved to the Cesar facility at Setsai. But it did pose its challenges on the operational front as well,
Sure.
because generally when it's new ownership, and you don't have much time, with barely a month and a little more to go to the start of a whole season,
Mm-hmm.
just the level of planning that's required, I think did pose its challenges. In fact, I said the other day, to on one of the interviews I was doing, that he says, "What has been your So the question to me was, what has been my most challenging moment in sport to date?
Right.
And I said, without a doubt, the first home game that we played, if I mistake now, was around the 17th of October 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And that first game, we were still trying to get in sync. We had plenty of negotiations with or discussions with the government, with the sports department, all of that, but just trying to ensure that things were in place, coming to a mutual agreement on deployment of, for example, the police personnel at the venue and all of that. So it so happened that on that first day, kickoff was probably at about 7 o'clock. And I kid you not when I say that until about 5:30,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, earlier that morning, we were finally granted the go-ahead by,
Wow.
the government of Goa to say, okay,
Wow.
you have all the permissions in place.
Mm-hmm.
You can officially host the game in Goa today.
Sure.
And then at about 5 o'clock, there obviously was some other discrepancy that they found somewhere, and then I was sent the show cause notice by
Wow.
virtue of being the one signing on all the letters to the government,
Mm-hmm.
and the permissions were withdrawn at five
Wow.
o'clock with kickoff at 7 o'clock, and yeah, and so the permissions finally came through at 6 o'clock. But that's yeah,
Unbelievable.
memories that you can look back and laugh upon now, smile upon now, 3 years
Right.
down the line. But being in the spot, not the easiest thing.
Right. Really
Yeah,
tough.
yeah,
Really tough. So,
yeah.
any plans to? I know you've started your new company, but any plans to go back?
Where to the corporate world? No, I think I'm really. I know the last few months have been tough. In fact, I often kind of wonder whether starting a company, on hindsight is a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
But starting a company last year made sense. But I
Mm-hmm.
think I've learned so much, Siddharth, and I'm grateful in a way that that in a way we were to face this mountain of a challenge with the pandemic so
Sure.
early on in the life of the company, because it's
Right.
it's just taught us so much. These challenges. I know everyone's been affected, unfortunately, but sometimes things could be going so smoothly, and then something like the pandemic that we are all facing
Sure.
could kind of send you, snowballing down,
Sure.
so or spiraling downwards, with having to factor in cost, the employees,
Yeah.
and so many other aspects. But we are fortunate that we had this very early on in the career, in the life of the company, and I think it's taught us a lot. So I kind of basically live with no regrets. I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy. I think every day has been a challenge, but
Mm-hmm.
every day has also taught us so much.
Sure.
you know so it's been a great ride. It's certainly been a roller coaster ride, but it's been a great ride. So if you ask me, well, I do work with clubs associations, but more as a consultant. But a
Right.
full-time, I would really have to reconsider that,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm now invested in the
Right.
company.
Right. And yeah, I mean that, like, now that you mention it, uh, the next time we'll be much more prepared, right? I mean, it's good that, I mean, you went let's say 2 or 3 years along in your company, and things would have become things would have probably been much worse than
Yeah,
they've been right
yeah.
now. And the next time, at least, you're more prepared, and you'll take into account different circumstances like these. So
Certainly, and Siddharth, I think I really feel for companies like you mentioned that are probably 2 3 years old, that were really on this trajectory
right.
path, went on hiring and hired quite a few staff, simply by virtue of the economy being in reasonably good shape, with sport growing with every passing year, and then suddenly having to face this and not realizing what to do with your employees and so many other projects that you probably were invested in.
Sure.
So from that point of view, we've been extremely, I would say, extremely fortunate that
Right.
we didn't have any of those worries to deal with.
Right. Right. So, okay, why don't you tell us about the new company?
So, in a nutshell, Siddharth, like I mentioned, in layman's terms, what we are essentially trying to do is help further propel India into becoming a sporting nation.
Mm-hmm.
How we are trying to achieve that is by, like I mentioned, connecting the dots. At the core of our business is sports infrastructure solutions, and that's something I'm extremely passionate about. So it's not only with creating sporting assets, but we also engage, individual promoters and invested parties and help them make commercial sense of that investment. You touched upon it very rightly, and that's what we tend to focus on. Ensure that these facilities are used for multi-purpose aspects, as opposed to being limited to probably one or two sporting disciplines.
Sure.
The other, we're also, like I mentioned, looking to channelize and develop talent at a young age. So we've got partnerships across Europe, and we're working closely to see how best kids identified at a young age, whether it's through scholarships, can have exposure to top quality football by virtue of spending probably a couple of years overseas through scholarships offered by these clubs.
Mm-hmm.
The other, the other, of course, which I believe has a huge market in India, still relatively untapped, is sports tourism. Unfortunately, given the pandemic, we've not been able to do much yet.
Right.
But we were looking to kind of really going with the national games in Goa. And I think the key is, whilst there are quite a few players in the market who look to take Indians to the biggest sporting, my apologies, the biggest sporting events across the world, we will look to make India, and hopefully start with Goa and then make India a sports tourism hub by attracting tourists, around sporting events in the country, so that's the plan. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, where can we find out more about this? What is it called?
We're Square Out Sports Solutions. Yeah.
Awesome. And how can people get in touch with you? I mean, get in touch with the company?
So we've had this interview at an interesting point, because we go live with our website, which is squareoutsports.com on Friday, Siddharth.
Awesome.
So looking forward to it.
Awesome. So, all right. So we'll have the link to the website. By the time this podcast comes out, the website will be live. So you guys can check the website out and get in touch with Mr. Rahul for any details, any inquiries, any partnerships, collaborations. I'm sure you'll be open to everything.
Certainly, Siddharth. I think the only way to grow is to work in tandem with all stakeholders. Make it inclusive, bring everyone on board, and that's the only way we'll drive forward.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Mr. Rahul. I mean, I know I took a lot of your time. I thought we were going to have it for like 30 to 40 minutes, but it was really interesting listening to you share your experiences and thoughts in football and sports.
Thank you, Siddharth. It's been such a pleasure. I didn't realize, and I wouldn't keep track of time when it comes to discussing sport. It's something we live on, we thrive on. And thank you for having me on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.